All right, so what we're going to take a look at now is one, I'm going to give you a solid definition of what is manifest destiny. Okay, so just so you have this on paper, you'll see that at the top of the note sheet, there's a blank there, and it's just answering the question of what is manifest destiny. And this is the belief that the United States was destined by God to expand throughout the continent. Okay, so it was God ordained, you may hear or read, it was God's design, we were always supposed to do it, those kinds of things and thoughts is the background and the thinking behind manifest destiny. Manifest is many times seen as it's manifesting itself, so it's coming true. The destiny of the United States is now happening as we move further and further west. Okay? And so to this video, we're going to take a look at some of the specific groups of people that did move into the West. At this point, you should have all already watched the video about the land acquisitions from 1776 to 1853. Now, if you haven't watched that video and got those notes, stop this video and go do that one first, okay? Because it's important that you understand how the land acquisitions happen, and then take a look at the different people who came along, because they do match up with the land and it will make more sense to you. Okay, so let's move on. All right, so who settled in the West? All right, well, the first group is actually a group that we have talked about some before, and this is your explorers group. This is primarily talking about Lewis and Clark, for example. You also had Zebulon Pike, and you had some others, but these are the most famous ones. Now, they had a couple of reasons that they're heading out west. First of all, they're trying to find the Northwest Passage. Okay, this is basically trying to find a solid water route to get all the way over to the quote northwest. Okay, this would have the idea being that this would cut down on shipping time when going to Asia and going across, and they never find it, but that's okay. That's what they're looking for. The other thing that they're doing is to find out what in the world was purchased in the Louisiana Purchase. Okay. So this is sort of what's called sight unseen. We had no idea what was there, but we bought it anyways because it was such a good deal. Now, they've faced a variety of hardships, and one of the big ones that a lot of people don't ever think about is blisters. So they were constantly having to row against the current. And well, these gentlemen were not always the most well, they didn't have what's called callous hands necessarily at this point in their lives. And as they did the work, blisters would form on their hands. And blisters can be quite painful. And it's not like they could say, oh, well, you know what, I'm just not going to use my hand for the next few days while it heals up. Nope, the next day, still had to keep rowing, had to keep going. And so these blistered hands would have made life a lot difficult for them. All right, you also had the mosquitoes. You have grizzly bears, which was a much bigger problem, and it was because there were way more grizzly bears in 1803, 1805, 1810 than there are today. They were all over the place in the western lands out there in the Louisiana Purchase, and they were massive, and there did not exist a gun that could take out a grizzly bear at the time. Now, the sound of the gun may scare them off, but that would have been about it. All right, so if you need a moment to go ahead and get the remaining bits of notes, just filling in those blanks for this particular slide, go ahead and do it now. Pause it. Otherwise, we're moving on. So what was the legacy of the explorers? What is it that they left behind, as it were? Well, first of all, they mapped a route all the way to the Pacific. They gave a map. Now, other groups will come along and create other trails and different trails and find other things, but it's a starting point. But really their biggest impact is the information about the West that they brought back. It truly captured the imagination of the American people at the time, and they heard about all these new plants and new animals, and just that the land was just so massive. There was so much of it that people just imagine they couldn't believe it. Because at the same time, what we're also starting to see is what's called the Industrial Revolution. So you definitely have people living in cities who were working in these factories, which were just and yet here are these stories about all these amazing creatures and all this stuff. And so it really captured the imagination of tons and tons of people. In particular, there's one group, they heard about the various animals that were out there. And they're going to be the next group we're going to take a look at in a minute. We call them the Mountain Men. So make sure you have these notes as we move on to our good buddies, the Mountain Men. All right, so the Mountain Men went west for, well, one reason and one reason only: fur. They were there to make money. They were there to get beaver pelts and various and sundry other hides and skins. Particularly the beaver pelt was a huge deal for a very long time for the Mountain Men. They were much thicker and plentiful than the pelts you would find in Europe. The waters they were in were much colder, and because of that, they developed a much thicker fur. And so it was a luxury item in Europe. Also, Europe had, killed off almost all their beavers, and so there weren't very many of them. And so the fact that they had all these, and they were better, higher quality, things like that, made them very, very, many of these mountain men, very wealthy. Okay. Now, they faced some pretty significant hardships while they were out in the West, rather. A couple things, and these two really go together. But the attack by, say, other fur thieves, you had the Indians, you had wolves, you had bears, oh my, and any of these attacks could have easily led to death, because any kind of injury, it's not like, you had any kind of real medical facilities of any kind out there, okay? They didn't, it's just things didn't exist. So the ones that really did the best are the ones who befriended the Native Americans, because the Native Americans had figured out how to survive in the conditions that these mountain men were in. They had developed what we would call home remedies today, natural remedies. And so the ones that were the smartest and did the best, they found Native Americans who would be friendly to them. They learned the land from them. They learned how to hunt in these lands. And then when they got injured, many times they would go to these Native American tribes for help. And they would help them because they were friends with each other. And so now any kind of accident, say a broken leg even, or anything like that, or some random disease could easily have killed them, okay? And so these are their specific hardships that they would have faced because they were out there for significant periods of time. And in fact, many times, some of them would go back east. They'd go back home to their families. You might have some of the more profitable ones would, in one season make the equivalent of 5 or 6 years' wages in a single season, and then you'll go back the next year. Now, many of the paths that these gentlemen laid out would stay on as trails, or part of the trail system, the groups of trails that many of the pioneers would take. And in fact, some of them, there's a couple of them that actually not only became trails, but then they became eventually roads. And not only that, there's a couple that the same paths that these mountain men took are a part of the interstate system that we have today. Now, what was the legacy of the mountain men? Well, there are, 4 different things really that they leave, and they're all kind of woven in together. So one, they meeting yearly at rendezvous, and these meeting points, much like the number 3 there, you see the trading post, have a very similar point in that they were specific spots. This would lead to people being there, more establishing of what would eventually become small towns and eventually cities, things like that. And as I mentioned to you earlier, the development of trails, and particularly the Oregon and California trails, would come from these gentlemen. And then eventually, as more of people were coming to simply to settle out west, these fur trappers and traders would eventually serve as guides for the pioneers, because again, they know the land better than any of those pioneers certainly did. And it was a lot easier to simply serve as a guide than it was to be out in the wilderness, catching the animals and things like that. Okay, so if you don't have anything here on the mountain men, this last little bit of the legacies, go ahead and pause it. Otherwise, we're moving on. All right, Californians. So this is a group that many people outside of the state of California have never, ever heard of, okay? But you're not going to be that way, because you're going to hear about them. So they started to come about really before the land was acquired by the United States in the Mexican Cession. But they definitely play a role after the Mexican Cession. And of course, Americans are going into this land long before it becomes U.S. territory. So why did the Californians move into the West? Well, first of all, they went to go establish missions. And missions are kind of this idea of a combination of a church and a settlement all at the same time. Okay? And this is primarily what you will see throughout this, what was the Spanish Empire, and then eventually it becomes the Mexican Empire, but particularly in the Spanish Empire, you see missions being established. Whereas when you take a look at the British or the French empires, for example, you just have colonies established. And so it's a little different. It does reflect how the Spanish were much more, you have the 3 G's of the Spanish explorers, and that God portion you see coming out in the establishment of these missions. Now, a lot of these Californios, they are uneducated, they're unskilled, and unfortunately, this leads to them being taken advantage of by government officials, whether it was in the Spanish Empire, Mexican Empire, or the United States. This is a common theme, unfortunately, for them. And they were also many times by themselves, or maybe 1 or 2 others, and then that's it. It wasn't like when, say, a British settlement or colony where you'd have maybe, you could have 50, 100, 200 people all going to establish this colony. It's not the way this worked for them. And so loneliness was definitely a problem for them. So you add all of that together, and this would have been a really difficult life that they were living. All right, so this next group, the Californios, they're really, unfortunately, not well known outside of the state of California, but you're going to get to know about them. So first of all, the legacy that they left is super duper important, okay? The legacy is that Spanish names in California. I know that seems like such a small thing, but it shows a lasting impact. Okay, and so if you were to take a look at a map and look at the city names in California today, you will see just Spanish name after Spanish name after Spanish name right on down the line. Okay, and everything from places like Los Angeles and San Jose, these are Spanish names, and then other named new cities even that are developed around them continue that, whether it's legacy or tradition, continues to happen. Now, arguably their biggest contribution, particularly to the state of California, is the new crops that they brought with them. Grapes, olives, and citrus in particular. Those continue to be a huge portion of the California's economy. And it's not just for California, of course. They export this stuff all over the world. So for example, grapes, well, the grapes eventually would lead to a pretty thriving wine industry in a place called Napa Valley. Napa Valley is one of those places that people just know you can get good wine from the Napa Valley. And then olives, in fact, California olives was in some circles are considered to be some of the best olives in the world. And last, you have citrus. Now there are people in this world that will eat California citrus. Not everyone though, but there is quite a bit of California citrus, oranges, lemons, limes, for example. These kinds of things which are grown in California, and it is a large portion of their economy. A lot of people think that California is either dry or a city, and that's just simply not true. But anyways, this is the group that brought those things to that area. All right, the next group to head west is a group, the Missionaries. So they had a singular reason to be heading west, and that was to convert Native Americans to Christianity. And one of the most famous was a man by the name Marcus Whitman, and you actually see a picture here of the Whitmans. Yes, they had pictures in the 1800s. And so this is his, you see a small picture of it here down in the right-hand corner. Okay, now, unlike some of the missions established by the Californios, this was truly more single-minded. They were not necessarily going to look to establish a city per se. They would go and for their own home and things like that, but that was it. But they would go typically as a family. So you'd have a husband, wife, kids, things like this. Okay. Now, some of the hardships that they faced was, of course, one was simply getting there. There were no really good roads. There were some trails by this point that had been hashed out, whether it be some of the mountain men or some of the other pioneers. But definitely crossing over the Rocky Mountains was no small task. In fact, it was quite difficult and could be extremely dangerous. And then even once you got there, some of the Native American tribes were friendly or friendly at first. Others were not. And so it's very possible that, and in fact, even some of the Whitmans would be killed by the Native Americans that they were working with. Okay? So this is the hardships that they faced. Now, what was their legacy? Well, it's a bit of a mixed bag. First of all, they unintentionally brought disease to these Native American tribes in the West. In much the same way that Europeans, when they first came to the Americas, brought disease with them on the East Coast and down in South America and Central America, these missionaries unintentionally did the same thing because they didn't understand germs and viruses and things like we do today. So it's not like they were running around trying to just make all the natives sick. On the other side of that coin, though, is that they did open up the West to future settlements. And the way this worked is that now that they're there, it made it easier for people to go west. Because it's much easier to move somewhere where there is someone else there who may be friendly, that kind of thing, as opposed to you just going and hoping in the middle of nowhere. Okay, so they definitely opened up the West. They helped to establish some early cities and small towns and things of this nature. Okay. All right, next group, pioneer women. This is arguably, they are the toughest group that went west. Okay, so there's actually a number of different reasons why they end up going west. Some were going west, that's where their families are going. Okay, families are looking for new opportunities that they're hoping that they can find somewhere out west. Some women went by themselves. They're going out to establish their own homes, their own homesteads, having their own land and place to live. And yes, some of them went looking for husbands. They couldn't find anything in the cities and back east, so they figured, why not head west and see what we find? So some of the difficulties and things that they faced is the trip itself, and along the way, unfortunately, many of these women, when they would head out, particularly, you see this, this number 2, the second hardship here, you see this among the women who are going out with their families. So as they packed up their things, you had a limited amount of space, and you had to be careful of how much weight you were taking, because you had to account for the food and essential supplies and spare parts for the wagon, things like this. And as you were traveling, many times it was necessary to try and lessen the burden on your, say, your oxen that are pulling your wagon. And so one of the things that would get left are these items, those things that may have been passed down from generations. It was great-grandmothers, and then it was their grandmothers, and then it was their moms, and now it was theirs. And unfortunately, many of them left these treasured items all along the Oregon Trail. And so this is one of those sort of hardships that I think a lot of people ignore because they don't realize how rampant it was and what an emotional toll this would have taken on many of these women who had left everything they'd ever known, left their family, their parents would never see them again. Many times, they left friends, they left all these things behind, and these items were very precious to them, and yet they found themselves having to leave them just basically on the side of the road. Now, the other issue that many of these women were having to deal with is that they were responsible for cooking, washing clothes, taking care of the children, all while traveling about 15 to 20 miles a day, usually on foot. So Oh, and also they would many times serve as a lack of a better term, a nurse to not only their own family, but any of the other families and people they'd be traveling with. And so they bore a tremendous burden on the trip west. Okay? Now, their legacy, their legacy is way more far-reaching than most people realize. First of all, they are the reason, honestly, there's any kind of schools, churches, libraries, like literary societies, charitable organizations, all of those kinds of social necessities. Um, education, for goodness sakes, libraries, books, all that kind of stuff. That was all brought because of women. The guys were not getting together and saying, you know what we really need as we travel west? Books. We need libraries. That's what we need. That just did not happen. All right? And so this was a tremendous legacy. That legacy also, when it comes to schools, this is part of the reason that when you think of teachers, you think of women. Because a lot of the teachers you'd have, they were single women who would end up teachers in these schools, and that legacy is even carried on to today. Another legacy, though, ironically, is that women got the right to vote in many states out west and territories out west long before it happened anywhere else in the country. And there was actually quite a bit more freedom for women in the West. Many times they could own property, they could vote, they had a say in what happened and those kinds of things. And that's another one of those reasons why many women would go west, because they are trying to establish themselves and gain more freedom. All right, so if you missed any of these notes, definitely make sure you get them before we move on to group number next. So this gets us to the Mormons. All right, so they moved west because they were being persecuted. And by persecuted, I mean being killed. They started in New York and they were killed there. They end up in Illinois, they were killed there. And so they continued going west. They were led initially and primarily by, as far as the last part of this western trip, by a man named Brigham Young. Okay, this is where we get Brigham Young University, also more commonly known now as BYU. And so their hardship, if you take a look at this picture, you see one of their biggest hardships. It's called a hand cart. And if you look there on the left-hand side of that cart, it's a person pulling it along. They did not have any kind of animals, such as ox, to pull their stuff along in a wagon. They did it themselves. So you were either walking or pulling the cart. Now, their journey was far more difficult than even some of the journeys of other pioneers, in part because the path that they took, became known as the Mormon Trail, paralleled the Oregon Trail just on the other side of a river. So they had to basically mark out their own trail, their own path. It wasn't well-worn or anything like that, as many of their contemporaries had. And so add into that they're pulling their own stuff along, and many of them died along the way. Now, add to that, when they got to the place where they could be, it was a dry, barren land. It was a desert, basically. All right, and we now know this as Utah, or at least the Salt Lake City area of Utah. So they basically got the land that no one else wanted. But at least they were safe, and that's why they ended up. And what they were able to do with that land is actually quite impressive. All right, so their legacies is much to do with that land. It's called the Great Basin. You can kind of see a picture of it here on the screen. We now call it Salt Lake City. And what they were able to do, a lot of the farming methods that they used, the way they created canals and irrigation ditches to get the water from, say, the mountains that surround it down into the land that they were using to farm. It was pretty innovative, especially for the time period. And the other thing that they did is they were able to establish a center for a worldwide religion there in Salt Lake. I mean, if you were to look at the influence of the Mormon Church and particularly throughout Utah, it is quite extensive. Many of the state laws are influenced by the church. Other politicians, things of this nature are still heavily influenced by the Mormon Church there in Utah. All right, our next group is the 49ers. So the 49ers, they were all about that gold. Man, they went out to the California area to try and get rich. And they came by the tens of thousands. Whether they were coming across the country or coming from around the world, it didn't matter. So it was a difficult journey to get to California. If you're coming across the land, you're crossing the Rocky Mountains. Otherwise, you're coming by sea and you're coming through the Pacific Ocean, which was a difficult journey. Either way, it was hard to get there. And almost all your 49ers, they were men. So there were not a whole lot of women there. Just saying, this is going to make life a lot more difficult. Now, also, there was a high demand for certain items, and not a lot of people who had them. This drives your prices up. There's also no police, so crime was all over the place, and you had to form these groups to take care of yourself. We might call them vigilante groups or committees. You must also call them gangs as well. And it was hard, boring, tedious work, and a really small percentage of the 49ers ever actually found gold and made it rich. Now, their legacy, well, first of all, they did unfortunately continue to reduce the Native American population. They did settle in what's called boom towns. Now, boom towns are when the population spikes up because of an event and then drops really quickly when the event is over. But many of these towns did remain, many of the people remained, and this allowed California to become a state pretty quickly, actually. Now, the other part of this is the Californios that we talked about earlier lost their land to many of these newcomers. Okay, and so it is a bit of a mixed bag, but it is unfortunately it is what it is when it comes to history, when it comes stuff like this. All right, our last group is the Chinese. Now, the Chinese came to the West for two reasons. One, they were a part of those gold rush, and two, they were brought in as essentially like slave labor to build the railroad. While there, first of all, they had taxing laws really specifically for them. So they were paying, if they did find any gold, the taxes they would pay on it were higher. They suffered from persecution, discrimination, things of this nature by the Americans that were there. They were very much treated like slaves, and many of them did die in the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. So their legacy, well, first of all, they are the single largest Asian group to come seeking gold. And with that, much of their culture has remained in the West. You still see a Chinese influence, particularly in California, more so than some other parts of the West. You still see that influence to this day. And of course, without them, there is no Transcontinental Railroad. It's just that simple and straightforward. All right, so that does wrap up the people who went west. Again, if you miss any of these pieces, definitely go back through the video and get those filled in to get those notes taken care of. If you have any questions, just let me know.